A little Hyperdyne and Dash on TurboWorks Episode 8.
Batmobile broke its wheel, the Joker got a
Why should Namco have all the fun? This week, arcade giant Capcom jumps on the Hudson train with a home conversion of, you guessed it, another arcade shoot-'em-up. So this is a pretty big one. I mulled the significance of seeing Capcom games on Sega Genesis back in the Ghouls N Ghosts episode, but maybe I should have saved that pontification for this week. Ghouls N Ghosts was big, no doubt, but Sidearms might be bigger. Maybe not in terms of cultural footprint or clout. Not a lot of people even remember Sidearms these days, especially not compared to Ghouls N Ghosts, and that game's port to Genesis in particular. In terms of corporate politics and the imminent 16-bit democratization of the console business after half a decade of Nintendo dominance, though, Sidearms sends quite a message. For starters, this game's PC Engine release predates the Mega Drive launch of Ghouls N Ghosts, or rather Dai Makaimura, by a full month, meaning it's the true bellwether here. More significantly, Capcom actually developed the TurboGrafx 16 port of Sidearms internally. With Ghouls N Ghosts and several other Genesis releases such as Strider, Capcom simply licensed their property out to Sega to adapt. Hence, Yuji Naka famously learning how to program sloped surfaces in a platform game while coding that release, making possible the entire existence of the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. But aside from a couple of games farmed out to Alpha System, Capcom appears to have handled their TurboGrafx 16 ports, and by extension, their Turbo CD and SuperGrafx ports themselves. Sidearms credits its development to NEC's publishing label, NEC Avenue, but the game credits presented at Moby Games and GDRI mostly consist of familiar Capcom names like Susuma Ueda of Gunsmoke fame, Naoe Nonomura of Black Tiger, and Yoshito Ito of Sun Sun 2 and Little Nemo. According to a Gaming.moe interview with Sidearms composer Takashi Tateishi, Capcom produced Sidearms for TurboGrafx 16 somewhat anonymously in order to avoid upsetting Nintendo. Relationships are very important in business, doubly so in Japanese business, and infinitely so when you're a publisher that owes its success in the 1980s entirely to making games for arcades and Famicom. I mean, it's not like Capcom was the first major third party to sign up with Hudson and NEC for TurboGrafx. In the past few episodes, we've seen awesome releases by Namco, Irem, and Compile, all studios who have published genre and even medium-defining work on NES or Famicom. I know I'm covering familiar ground here, but it's not like those companies were in some exclusive wedlock with Nintendo. There was friction between Irem and Nintendo ever since the latter's president yoinked the rights to produce Kung Fu as a first-party title against the development staff's wishes. Compile was more of an MSX independent and a Sega collaborator than a Nintendo diehard. And Namco, as I've elaborated on recently, couldn't wait for other console publishing options besides Nintendo's ecosystem to come along. Capcom, on the other hand, was not like those companies. Established in 1983, they shipped their first arcade cabinet in 1984, and their first Famicom cartridge arrived at the end of the following year. Capcom quickly became one of the enduring giants of the Famicom and NES, with massive successes on both sides of the Pacific. The company literally existed in parallel with the Famicom, and it had exclusively existed in the console space as a Nintendo partner until Sidearms shipped for PC Engine in December 1988. Sure, they happily licensed games out for other companies to develop on computers, but that really only happened in the US and Europe, which suggests that those deals were made by Capcom's international arcade distributors, like Romstar. So Sidearms here is kind of a big deal. It shows once again that some of Nintendo's key licensees had begun to explore other options. Never the sign of a happy marriage. It's not like Capcom suddenly abandoned Nintendo. NES and Super NES would continue to be the company's primary revenue generator in the home space. But now it would no longer be their only revenue generator. It's not hard to see the TurboGrafx's appeal for Capcom. I mentioned earlier that all of Capcom's arcade to TurboGrafx conversions were published either internally at Capcom or by NEC's partner studio, Alpha System. I said nothing about who developed Capcom's original releases for TurboGrafx because there was only one. About a dozen Capcom titles appeared on TurboGrafx and Friends, and of those, every single release simply adapted an arcade title, except for Sun Sun 2. And that, I think, explains why Capcom took to the TurboGrafx 16 so eagerly. Although Capcom never really led the industry in terms of arcade tech the way Namco and Sega did in the 80s, they had an incredible knack for delivering new, fresh, best-in-class play experiences on their good but not cutting-edge hardware. Eventually, Capcom's revenue allowed them to develop the CP system family, which did in fact put them at the bleeding edge of arcade tech for nearly a decade. But prior to that, no one really looked at Capcom's output and said, "Holy crap, video games can do that?" Instead, they looked at Capcom cabs and said, "That looks super fun, I should try it." And then they promptly found themselves running out of quarters thanks to the challenging yet addictive work of designers like Tokuro Fujiwara, Takashi Nishimura, and Yoshiki Okamoto. And you can see Capcom attempting to reconcile the growing ambition and tech of their arcade creations with the fixed limitations of the NES hardware. Heck, Ghosts and Goblins was the first NES game to ship on a chip capable of memory management, but even the beefiest MMC add-on couldn't bring the true Capcom experience home to NES. As soon as Capcom took its Famicom and NES development in-house and out of the hands of Micronix, their designers and programmers began grappling with the tension between cool play experiences that they crafted for arcades and the humdrum limitations of NES. Commando and Trojan added home-exclusive features, including an early attempt at a one-on-one fighting game that predated Street Fighter. By the time the CP system debuted, Capcom had more or less resigned itself to completely reinventing its games for NES. Sometimes this worked for the better, sometimes for the worse, but ultimately, it came down to a matter of practicality, to make sure those releases were at least fun to play, even if they weren't arcade accurate. I mean, Strider is a mess on NES, and Willow is a completely different game than the coin-op, but on the other hand, I honestly rank the NES version of Bionic Commando as one of my 10 favorite games of all time. As it happens, Capcom's big turning away from arcade fidelity on NES came with Section Z. The original Section Z was a fun, if slightly mundane side-scrolling shooter with a couple of interesting gimmicks. One, your little guy flew both vertically and horizontally as the stage layouts dictated, moving through a sequence of interconnected segments labeled Sections A through, yes, Z. Secondly, your little guy could turn and fire, either left or right, while moving freely, thanks to the way the two fire buttons determined his attack orientation. Kind of like the original Double Dragon, but shootier. The NES port retained the latter feature, but despite the reference in its title, it discarded the A to Z section divisions and the continuous stage flow. Instead, it gave its sections numbers, broke each one into a separate self-contained space, and gave players agency over which section they traveled to at the end of a zone by giving them 2 exit gates. This turned Section Z into something of a maze game, possibly inspired a bit by the previous year's Metroid, which had a similar sci-fi vibe and look. The NES version of Section Z even had a progressive power-up system that allowed protagonist Captain Commando to build up his maximum hit points. Colliding with an enemy spelled instant death, but as he grew in durability, he could shake off an increasing number of projectile attacks. Sort of the opposite of Rolling Thunder, but also shootier. Which brings us to Sidearms, the direct sequel to Section Z, and handily a case in point for the TurboGrafx 16's value in a world where the NES exists. Unlike Section Z for NES, Sidearms on TurboGrafx is a doggedly faithful arcade port. It's not a pixel-for-pixel recreation of the coin-op, but it comes pretty damn close. The biggest change to Sidearms for TurboGrafx 16 has to do with cooperative play, namely that the home version has none. In arcades, Sidearms allowed 2 people to team up and take on the game, something that fed into one of Sidearms' standout features. By collecting a certain icon, both players could link into a fusion ship that fired in both directions at once. The home version retains this link-up feature, but since you have to play solo, all that the fusion feature does is make you stupid powerful. Capcom appears to have recognized the fact that this option makes you unbelievably overpowered because the home version of Sidearms actually feels more challenging than the coin-op. This is an unbelievably difficult game. I know I say that a lot because I'm an old man with bad reflexes now, but they absolutely added a little extra sauce to the difficulty level in Sidearms. It seems like smooth sailing for about a stage and a half, but that's a lie. The opening stage barely makes use of the dual direction mechanic, with most enemies attacking you from the right. It's very, very generous with its power-up drops, allowing you to build up a frightful level of power pretty quickly so that you can steamroll everything in your path. But that's really just the game softening you up so that you become complacent. Once the gloves are off, they never come back on. Sidearms has a lot of nasty tricks in its repertoire. For one thing, it fully takes advantage of the fact that you can fire freely in both directions by pouring enemies in from all sides. Not just left and right, but also top and bottom. There is no safe space on the screen, and you certainly can't just hang back to the left as in most horizontal shooters. The enemies that approach from behind move and fire just as aggressively as the ones from the front. And as in the original Section Z, the scrolling here also sometimes makes a 90-degree pivot and sends you downward, fending off enemies from the sides while dangers loom from below. Not that the scroll direction needs to shift for enemies to justify attacking from the top or bottom edges of the screen. When I say the bad guys pour in from all sides, I do mean all. And Sidearms has an even nastier trick than the all-direction action. Or really, an enhancement of all-direction action. Homing enemies. I've never played a game with enemies and projectiles that center in and hunt you down more than Sidearms. These take many forms, from missiles to serpentine mechanisms that you have to blast away a segment at a time. At any given moment, you may have to deal with half a dozen objects circling around the screen to kill you. They move fast, often take multiple hits from standard weapons, veer at you from difficult angles, and demonstrate an almost freakish degree of persistence. In a lot of games, homing enemies will give up and fly off if they miss you on their first or second pass. Likewise, they'll often self-destruct once you pass certain checkpoints, evade them for a fixed amount of time, or defeat the enemy that launched them. Not in Sidearms. Homing threats will just keep going and going, hunting you doggedly as you attempt to manage more linear threats. They never give up or self-destruct. You can kite them into a boss battle by mistake, forcing you to deal with the homing hazard in addition to a boss. And if you blow up a boss after it launches you seeking missiles, well, don't relax and rush over for those power-ups too eagerly. That's when the missiles circle back around and blow you up, dishing you a defeat in the clutches of victory. On top of that, Sidearms offers barely more than zero mercy invincibility when you respawn or begin a new stage. You have maybe half a second to get your bearings and start moving out of the way of danger once you fly onto the screen. Given the density of projectiles and enemies in Sidearms, it can sometimes be impossible not to respawn in a way that makes it impossible to avoid dying. It doesn't help that you have a pretty big hitbox for your irregularly sized and shaped mech. Sidearms dishes up power-ups almost as generously as blazing lasers, though these definitely feel like late 80s Capcom power-ups. You can trick out your mech into a pretty impressive ball of destruction, but you have to work for those upgrades. By default, most power-ups appear as POW icons that enhance your speed, but you can shoot them to cycle through different weapon forms. These will remind you of the ones in 1943, and I don't just mean the cow icons. There's a shotgun weapon, for example, that destroys enemy projectiles, straight out of 1943. And as in 1943, your projectiles don't pass through icons when you shoot them, which means that a power-up can also make a situation more difficult when enemies hunker on the opposite side of a field of icons, pelting you with bullets from outside your own attack's reach until you either snag the icon at great personal risk or skip the icon, sail past, and fire back in reverse. The power-up system here is nowhere near as lyrical as the one in Blazing Lasers, bombarding you with different weapons that largely work the same. There are spread patterns and super powerful single beams, and everything beyond that is just details. Given the sheer number of foes and projectiles appearing on screen once you get into the thick of the action, spread attacks are really the only way to go. You have the option to collect multiple power-ups and pause the game to toggle between them, but honestly the action is so frantic that you never really have time. Sidearms gives you a few lives and a few credits with which to reach the end, but I assure you that I would not have seen even a quarter of the game had I not used an infinite continues cheat. It's really easy to get into a death loop situation due to the respawn system and unbelievable amount of deadly crap flying around all the time, and burn through an entire credit in less than a minute. Not that the game really offers that much variety. You face the same sets of enemies and variations on the same 4 bosses up through the very end, like a slightly more diverse take on legendary Wings bestiary. The final boss is at least thematically cool. After passing through a stage of what appear to be the remains of god warriors from Nausicaa, you reach a sort of satanic emblem where a giant version of the serpentine seeker monsters appears and slithers around the screen spewing bullets. Sidearms is not great from a design perspective. From a technical view, however, it's kind of amazing. The speed, visual detail, audio quality, and volume of things flying around without noticeable slowdown or flicker reinforces the idea of TurboGrafx 16 as a generational hardware leap. No wonder Capcom jumped on this console. It would admittedly have had more impact in Japan. Once again, the TurboGrafx 16's late launch in America meant that Sidearms arrived here at exactly the same time as its sequel hit Genesis, rather than having the half-year lead that Sidearms enjoyed in Japan. I'm speaking, of course, of Forgotten Worlds, the two-direction scrolling shooter with two-person simultaneous play and an economy, on a system with a great marketing budget, as opposed to one with, no marketing. And that is why people remember Section Z and Forgotten Worlds, but not Sidearms. All things being equal, a pretty damn good if truncated port of a CP system game with co-op play intact would have been a lot more impressive than a near-perfect port of an older game that dropped the co-op. But this is the TurboGrafx 16 story in America condensed into a nutshell. Far more impressive than console experiences that had come before, but maybe not quite as impressive as the console experiences that came contemporaneously. Alas for Sidearms, neither as impressive as Forgotten Worlds nor as well crafted as Blazing Lasers. But that's okay. It's not like this is the most significant Capcom arcade conversion for 1989. That's coming up in a few episodes. Next time on TurboWorks, they say 2 heads are better than 1, so wait till they get a load of 3.